Welcome to World Storytelling Day. On this day, across the globe, people gather together and they tell and listen to stories in every kind of language, in all sorts of places. Today, Durham Storytellers are bringing you immigrant and refugee stories that reflect the storytelling theme for this year, which is Together We Can. Our storytellers today will be Kesha Christie, Dianne Chandler, Heather Whaley, and Kathleen Smyth. So let's get started with our story, shall we?
There is a song. It is a Jamaican folktale that we call an identity song. For all those who are traveling from Jamaica to the New World, be it the UK or Canada, whenever you walk into a space and wanted to identify a Jamaican, you would sing this chorus. Hill and Gully Rider. And the other person would answer, Hill and Gully Rider, Hill and Gully. So let's give it a try today. Hill and Gully Rider, Hill and Gully. Hill and Gully Rider, Hill and Gully. And that way you would know you had a fellow Jamaican in the room. When I first started thinking about what is my family's immigration story, I remember that my grandfather told me one thing. Almost every conversation he would say, Kesha, remember you're a maroon. A maroon? I did not know what that meant other than the color. But as years passed and with the help of ancestry DNA, I found out what my grandfather meant. He meant that I was a descendant of the Maroons. And the Maroons were black people that lived in Jamaica who were never enslaved. They were fighters and warriors. And the best part is, I learned that the Maroons came to Canada in the 1600s. But if I tell you that story, we would be here till the end of today and maybe into tomorrow. So I thought I'd fast forward a bit. And I wanted to tell you the story of my grand-aunt, who was a traveler. She was a businesswoman and wanted to do better for herself. And so when the borders opened in the UK, that is when she traveled. Now, that would mean that she was in the UK between 1948 and 1971. She was known as the Windrush generation, who went to the UK to help with the worker shortage. She was there and she lived and was happily. But when she heard that Canada opened its borders, she returned to Jamaica and came to Canada in the late 1960s. And the first thing she did was settle, find work, and start bringing up her family. She brought her brothers, her nieces, and her daughters. And my mother, she was one of those nieces. My mom came to Canada at the age of 16. This was news to me. My mother came to Canada and went to high school, much like I did. But the thing was, my mother was able to live in an area that's known as Little Jamaica. It's on Eglinton West in Toronto, from the Allen Road to Dufferin. And this is a place where if you ever wanted to have anything related to Jamaica, that's where you would go. If you were craving Jamaican food, that's where you would be. Clothing and even the conversation. You could bawl out to the patois and somebody would reply. It was a good time. My mother left Jamaica on a plane called Air Jamaica. And this was a plane that people would say it was a joke. You'd have your final meal because no one knew what you were going to eat when you got to Canada. So you would be able to get jerk chicken, oxtail, whatever they were serving that day. And did you know they had fashion shows too? Yeah, they wanted to show you how you could dress in Canada. It was a good time. And you'd think that things would always be good, or her most difficult challenge would be the weather. Because back then, the weatherman was more accurate than today. If he said minus 15, it was minus 15. Except if you turned the corner. When that breeze hit your face, it could be any kind of degrees outside. My mother said there was many times where she forgot her own name. But she liked traveling to and from school, and she did this on the bus, the TTC. My mom became a people watcher. She loved to watch people and how they moved in the world. And she used to think of how the experiences related back to folktales that she grew up listening to. And on this particular day, there were two people having a disagreement, we'll say a lively debate on the subway. And she watched and she looked at them and she thought, you know, this person over here reminds her of Donkey. And this person over there reminds her of Toad. There was a story called Toad and Donkey Have a Race. And that's the story she was thinking of. I'm going to share it with you now. There was a time where every argument or disagreement was settled among the animals with a race. And on this day, Donkey and Toad were having a disagreement. And you know how it goes. They were about to race. Well, all the other animals started to gather around, wanting to see what the trouble was. But like me, I love an underdog, so my vote would have been for Toad, and so were the other animals. So when Donkey said, let's race today, and Toad said he needed more time, the other animals agreed with Toad and said, you can have a day to prepare. And that's what he did. He went home trying to figure out how he was going to win this race. You see, when everyone said, make the race 5 miles, Donkey piped up and said, no, it's too short. And so they ended up with a 20-mile race. How was Toad going to win? Well, Toad went home to the family and waited for dinner, listening to the children run about the place. And he counted as they leaped across in front. 1, 2, 3, 4, made it all the way to 20. Toad had 20 children. This gave Toad an idea. There were 20-mile markers, and at each mile, Donkey would have to call out, and so would Toad. But that doesn't mean, Let me tell you something. All of Toad's children were what we would say blood follow vein. They looked exactly alike. You couldn't tell them apart unless somehow you were related to the family. So, Toad had a great idea. He went for a walk with his children. And at each mile marker, one child stayed. And they were told, when you hear Donkey call out, you call out too. And so, on race day, this is what happened. When all of the animals were gathered at the start line, everyone started to call out, Toad, where's your family? Toad said, don't worry about my family. My children are doing chores. The race was about to begin. On your mark, get set, go. Well, Toad was having a terrible time trying to get across the start line, but Donkey ran off and then decided, you know what? I don't need to move so fast. So Donkey decided to eat. He ate grass, he ate peas, and even took a nap in a field while Toad was making their way to the mile marker. When Donkey finally made it to the first mile marker, he said, look at this. No sign of Toad. I'm gonna win, I'm gonna beat Toad. And as soon as he finished that sentence, he heard, "Rrr, rrr." He looked around, he couldn't believe it, there was Toad. This time Donkey thought to himself, he spent too much time resting and playing and eating. He's going to move faster. So he did. At the second mile marker, he said again, hee-haw, I'm going to win. And then he heard, oh my goodness, how could Toad be here too? Off he ran even faster. The third mile, the fourth mile. By the time he got to the fifth mile, Donkey was very confused. He didn't understand. Why is it when he said hee-haw, he always heard but couldn't see Toad anywhere? Well, the finish line was the start line. So Donkey made his way all the way around. And as he was coming closer and closer to the finish line, that's the 20-mile marker, he saw a lump in the middle of the finish line. And he thought, I'm gonna run around the rock. So he was swinging his tail back and forth, helping him to go faster. He ran faster and faster, and the closer he came to the finish line, he realized that lump, it wasn't a rock. It was, could it be? It really was. It was Toad who took the final leap across the finish line and won the race. Yee-haw! Donkey was so upset. So there was my mother, sitting on the bus, watching these two folks have a disagreement. And she had to wonder to herself, was the one that she named Toad, was that the one of Toad's children, or was that the Toad that won the race? That was a great story. Folktales always teach us different lessons, but here we're able to see that no matter what our differences are, We can be one and the same. And to this day, I don't think it's known that the toad that began the race is not the same one that finished it.
Mom, I didn't want to get a scale anymore. They didn't care what I'm speaking about, I didn't care what they're speaking about, and I just want to stay here with ye. These were the first words that I said to my mother on my first day of kindergarten. What I said was, I don't want to go to school anymore. They don't understand me, and I don't understand them, and, well, I just want to stay home with you. It had only been 6 weeks from the time that we had emigrated from the northeast coast of Scotland, from a small city called Dundee. Now, most people would think, if you're from Scotland, you're part of the British Isles, and of course, you would naturally speak English, but that was not the case. The Scots language is spoken at home and everywhere else around the town, but English is actually learned in the primary schools. Now, Scots language, because of all of the invasions and because of all of the immigration that's happened in Scotland, is actually a mixture of all sorts of languages. The Irish Gaelic, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, German, Dutch, French, and Old English. That day, when I was off to school for the first time, my mother walked me to school, as all mothers do, and she waited and made sure that I got into the correct line so I'd know which class I was in. And then she stood there and waved and waited until I went into the building. Now, after we all sat down in our classrooms, I was waiting, and then the teacher, well, she introduced herself, and she welcomed all the children to the class. And I started to get really panicked. I was so worried because she was speaking a different language than I was, and I didn't know what to do. The first thing I thought of was, I'd like to run home, but I didn't know where that was. Well, then she took attendance. And one by one, the children put up their hands when their names were called. And of course, I knew my own name, so I put up my hand too. I didn't want to feel foolish. Later, recess came. And the kids, well, they were all playing, and I just stayed off to myself. I was rather shy then, and I felt uncomfortable because I knew that I didn't speak the same language as they did. And of course, as kids do, some of them came up to actually talk to me. And I told them I didn't understand. And they tried again, and I told them again I didn't understand them. Well, they just gave up, and they went off and played with the other kids. I was so sad, and as soon as I went back into the classroom, I decided that I was just going to stay silent for the whole day. When I was talking to my mother about never going back to school again, she said to me, "Dinna fuss yourself, lassie," which means, "Don't worry, daughter. Everything's going to be okay. Eventually, you're going to learn the language, and they're going to understand you, and you're going to understand them." Well, I tried to believe her, but that night, I cried myself to sleep. And for several nights afterwards, I was just so miserable. All I wanted to do was to go back and play with those kids on St. Fillan's Road in Dundee again. I didn't like this place called Canada at all, this foreign country, not one little bit. Well, the next day, I went back to school, and I tried again in my Scots dialect to be able to converse with the children, and again, they didn't understand me, and I just gave up. I felt so stupid, and it really upset me. However, I decided the only thing that I could do would be to sit and be quiet and watch and listen. And that's exactly what I did. Now, my teacher, she understood that I was having trouble, and she was trying to be very kind to me. And she even tried to understand what I said when I went, "Oh, I need to get into the kludgy, the shunky, the yuffie." Well, I know she knew by my body language that I just had to go to the washroom, so she showed me where that was. After a while, I decided that I really wanted to learn to speak the English language and be just like all the other kids. So what I did was I decided that I would always be up at the front of the classroom. And as soon as she brought out those picture books, the ones with the beautiful illustrations and just a few words to each picture, then I could watch as she put her finger across every word, and then I could see the picture and I could understand what the story was about. And of course, she read these stories many times over. And of course, we also had rhyming games and songs that had lots of repetitions. And I started to get the sounds in my ear, and I started to understand. Well, it didn't take too much longer where I could speak to the kids in my class and I could play with them. And I thought to myself, it's just like playing with my little friends on St. Fillan's Road in Dundee. I was so happy. And it took a little while before I finally got it all together. But by the end of the year, I was speaking quite fluently. And I had learned the language really well and quickly. Now, it's kind of funny that all through school, both grade school and high school, English was my best subject. And I had the highest marks in English. And I think it was because of the time that I would listen and observe and watch, just like I did in kindergarten. And those skills helped me to understand the language a whole lot better. Now, I have to say that at the time that I was going to school, it was a lot different than it is today. Teachers didn't have the skill sets. They didn't know how to teach children another form of language along with what they were already teaching. And English as a second language just didn't exist. So they struggled, both teachers and students, to be able to communicate with one another. On top of that, it became evident that those kids would eventually learn, but it took a longer time. Now, immigrant kids today, well, it's a little bit easier for them, but don't misunderstand me. It's still hard to learn another language. And lots of these kids, they have different alphabets, or sometimes they have characters that they use to construct their words. But you know, with the help of the teachers and the English as a second language teachers, and of course you, children like you, that they can be helped to learn the language and be able to speak it well, just like I did.
Were you ever in Quebec, stowing timber off the deck, where there's a king with a golden crown, riding on a donkey? Hey ho, away we go, donkey riding, hey ho, away we go, riding on a donkey. Well, you probably think that I'm singing about a donkey that says hee-haw, long ears, but I'm not. I am referring to a steam engine. It's a little auxiliary steam engine that was used over 100 years ago. Strong, to lift cargo onto ships and trains. Were you ever off the Horn, where it's always nice and warm, where there's a lion and a unicorn riding on a donkey? Hey ho, away we go, donkey riding, hey ho, away we go, riding on a donkey. And you can sing that chorus anytime you want. Well, my papa, Niccolo Capro, came to Canada around the Thunder Bay area near Lake Superior in 1906 from Italy. Were you ever in Cardiff Bay, where the folks all shout hooray? Here comes Johnny with 6 months' pay, riding on a donkey. Hey ho, away we go, donkey riding, hey ho, away we go, riding on a donkey. My papa came when he was between the age of 16 and 17 years of age to work on the Canadian North Railway. Now the railway is called the Canadian National Railway. Many railways amalgamated, and now we have this large one. Well, my grandpa came with his brother Emile, who was about 4 or 5 years older than him. I have no idea where they lived exactly. And how do I know his story? Well, I interviewed my Uncle Dennis, my grandpa's son, my mother's brother, and I found out so much more than I ever knew. My papa did not speak any English. He only had a grade 4 education. The story goes that he worked on an olive farm for a while. So there he was, a newcomer to Canada. But he learned to speak English, and he was a very industrious man. He eventually was promoted to a foreman. Now that was a big thing for someone like my grandfather. And of course he made money. And the more money he made, the more dreams he had. And he ended up in a town called Vermilion Bay near Dryden in Ontario. There he purchased a store where he sold everything from soup at the nuts, literally from cans of soup to nuts and bolts and hammers. Everyone in the community would come to his store. There is a story my uncle told me, and I don't know if it's true. In memoir, when somebody tells you a tale, you hope to believe it. But this is what he said. He said there was a gentleman who had arrived from China, living in the area, and came into my papa's store and asked for a pair of boots for his wife. Size 6, he said, and they need to be sturdy boots. So my grandfather went back into the back room and he brought out a pair of nice leather boots, size 6. He told the gentleman they were $1.99. Oh, that's a lot of money back then. And the gentleman hung his head. He couldn't afford $1.99 for a pair of boots. And when he told my grandfather went back and said, I have another pair, hang on. And he brought back another pair that looked exactly the same. And he said, these ones are 99 cents. Sold. It's an endearing story. And I hope it's true. Another thing my uncle told me was that my grandfather was one of the first in that community in Vermilion Bay to have a horse and a buggy. He had enough money. And what people did was ask him for rides, and they'd pay him. Ah, not a bad business. Eventually, my papa made it to Thunder Bay, which was at the time Twin Cities, the Lakehead, Port Arthur, and Fort William. I grew up in Port Arthur. My papa was one of the first to have a car when automobiles were invented. And guess what kind of business he had? You guessed it. People asked for rides, and eventually he had Cap's Taxi. He had one in Fort William and one in Port Arthur. He met my grandmother earlier on and raised his family. My mother and 2 sons. My grandpa was one of the most resourceful people I ever knew. I'm very proud of my grandfather. He would walk through the town, I remember, with his vest and his tie and his hat. And he had a nice barrel chest. And everybody would greet him. There's a story I remember that I'd like to share. When my papa passed away, when I was 16, going on 17, the buffet that sits in my grandparents' home, or sat in their home at the time, brought back a lot of memories for me. My papa used to sit in a chair close to this buffet, and he smoked a pipe at the time. And he'd say, if you go into that drawer and you get me my pipe, there's a little bowl of candy, you can have one. I lived with my grandmother for about 4 or 5 years. And that was such a special drawer to even pull out as a young woman. I said to my grandmother, please don't sell that buffet. I'll buy it one day. Guess what? When she passed away at 82, my uncle told me the buffet was mine. All I had to do was pay for the shipping. And do I have a bowl of candy in that drawer for keepsake? Yes, I do. A folk tale called The Olive Tree always brings me back to remembering my papa, my grandfather, who arrived from a little town called Atessa in Italy. There was once a farmer who had 2 sons, and they hated working on that olive farm. It was a very prosperous orchard, and the farmer did very well for his 2 sons. His wife had long passed. Well, when his time came to die himself, he called his sons to his bedside. And instead of saying that they inherited all of the property, he said, in the orchard there is a pot of gold. Dig for it. While these 2 boys were so upset, what is he talking about? They were going to sell the orchard. They were going to make money and go off into the world, like my papa did, and live a different life. While they dug in between the trees, the rows of trees, and back, no pot of gold. They eventually dug around each of those trees, digging up the soil, loosening it. And eventually, they got to the end of the rows, no pot of gold. Well, they weren't happy campers, let's put it that way. But come harvest in the fall, that orchard flourished more beautiful than they had ever seen. There were so many olives. People came They had the olives picked. People bought them and filled up. You guessed it. Pots full with gold.
This is a true story. It started 8 years ago in 2015, and it goes like this. Late one night in August 2015, a car driven by a people smuggler snuck out of the city of Mosul in northern Iraq. The smuggler's passengers were a mother, her 4 daughters, and 1 son. Their father had died recently, and Sarah, the mother, had paid the smuggler a great deal of money to help them, to assist them to escape from Mosul and Iraq. Mosul was no longer a safe place to live. She and her family had made their plans a few days before. They could only take what they could carry. And so they filled a big bag with food and water. Now, Sarah, the mother, had decided they were not going to leave their precious, fluffy white cat, Kunkush, behind. Kunkush, with his big yellow eyes and little round nose shaped like a heart, was part of the family. He was going to go with them. She prayed that he not make a sound inside the carrier, inside a small, round, basket-like carrier with a lid that locked. She prayed he wouldn't make a sound, for if the smuggler discovered them and discovered him, she'd be made to pay a lot more money. After 2 hours of driving, the car stopped, still in the darkness. They were told to get out, and another smuggler was waiting for them, waiting to take them on foot through the forest and over the mountains, stopping only to eat and to drink and to sleep. Every time that they stopped, Sarah would take the basket in behind some of the trees, and she'd let Kunkush out and feed him, give him more food and water and a chance to stretch before they continued. Now, Sarah was concerned about her children. She was concerned how they would react, but they seemed to think that this was a great adventure. They were even bursting into song somewhere along as they walked through the 3 days of walking through the forest and over the mountains. As they walked with the leader in the front, the smuggler leading the way, and the children strung out behind, Sarah and her son took turns carrying Kunkush at the back of the line, hoping that if he meowed, the smuggler wouldn't hear him. On the 4th day, they came to a Kurdish village, probably in Turkey. And there was another smuggler waiting for them to take them on a bus and drive them all across Turkey, from east to west to the big city of Istanbul. Once safely in Istanbul, and by the way, on the way, the family's job was to be on the lookout, continually on the lookout for patrols following them and trying to catch them. But once they safely got to Istanbul, they were moved from apartment to apartment to apartment. But at least this way, Kunkush had a chance to run and play in the apartments. At the end of 2 weeks, they were told it was time for them to cross the Aegean Sea and to Greece. Another bus picked them up and drove them the almost 6-hour drive from Istanbul to a city named Izmir on the Turkish coast. And when they got there, they had to walk 3 hours down the beach until they were told, put on these life preservers. You're going to take a boat ride across 6 miles of open sea, the island of Lesbos in Greece, their first step into the European Union and their first step towards a new home and a new safe place to live. Kunkush and his family were jammed, crammed into a small, flimsy, inflatable rubber boat, built to hold 25 people. But there were more than 60 men, women, and children crowded into that boat. As soon as they were shoved off and launched into the water, the boat began to take on water. It was far too heavy. The people on the shore called out, "Throw over your possessions, throw them out." But most of them refused. I mean, it's all they had. It's all they had with them. Finally, the partially sinking and overcrowded boat returned to shore. And in a crush of people to get off, panicking, frightened people to get off, the lid of Kankush's carrier was broken. Sarah called to her children, "You stay on there. We're going to make sure we get to Lesbos. You stay there." And finally, the boat was launched again, this time with much, much fewer people. Sarah was concerned for her children. She was worried about them, but her daughters seemed totally unconcerned. They were enjoying the ride in the sunshine after being hidden away in the darkness for so long. It was their excitement that made the trip go much easier. Sarah held Kankush's basket up, trying to keep it out of the water and out of the waves, but finally, one big wave washed over everyone, and everyone was drenched. On the island of Lesbos, hundreds of volunteers from all around the world were waiting on the beach to help the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of refugees who were coming in every day. Finally, Kankush's and his family's boat hit the sand and the beach. And the sun hopped out and took Kankush's carrier and splashed through the water up onto the shore, found a safe, dry place, and set the carrier down. And then he turned to go back for his family, help his mother and his sisters out of the boat. Kankush, inside that carrier, was soaking wet and terrified. All the strange sounds, all the strange voices, and finally he just pushed up. He pushed up on that broken lid and got out, and he escaped and disappeared quickly into the woods. When Kankush's family came to get him in the basket, he was gone. The other passengers were lining up to board another bus on their next step to a safe new home. But Kankush's family refused to go. No, they would not go without their cat. Several of the volunteers stayed back to help them. Look, they searched up and down the beach for hours and hours, calling his name. But at last they had to give up. The heartbroken family had to go on the next step towards a new home in a safe place. Now, on the island of Lesbos, nearby where Kankush's family had arrived, there was a little fishing village. And in the village, there was a whole colony of cats. Now, no one owned them, but the fishermen kept them well fed. Volunteers, a couple days after the family had left, volunteers began to notice a white cat hanging around the local cafes. His fur was matted and filthy, and he looked as if he was starving. The island cats would have nothing to do with him. They knew he was a stranger. They hissed and spat and chased him away. I hope we as humans would never do that. One of the volunteers, Amy, spoke to her friend Ashley, who was also a volunteer, and she told her about the cat she'd seen in the village, and she wondered, could this cat be the lost cat that the family had been searching for? They questioned the villagers, and they decided that they would search. They would search the island and see if they could find this cat. And they did. Matted fur, filthy, and definitely starving. They picked him up and they carried him to the nearest veterinarian, Dr. Constantina. She took a razor and she shaved off all Kankush's matted, filthy hair. And then she gave him medicines and his shots. She said, this cat needs a name for now. What? And she suggested the name Diaz. Diaz for strength. Diaz is a Greek term for the king of the ancient gods, the one we call Zeus. And this cat was going to need as much strength as he could get. Amy and Ashley took Kankush Diaz back to her apartment. Now, even though he'd been shaved, his hair was still filled with sand and bugs, and Amy gave him a bath. She scrubbed him well, and he was very, very clean. And 5 minutes after his bath, the exhausted cat collapsed face down halfway through a meow and slept. Diaz stayed with Amy in her apartment for over a month. Often she watched him as he prowled through the apartment, yowling and yowling. She was sure he was looking for his family. She and Ashley had determined that they were going to reunite this cat with his lost family. That was going to be their goal. They spoke to the other volunteers, and they made posters, flyers. And one of Amy's friends back in the States, Michelle, she made a Facebook page for Diaz. People around the world saw the Facebook page, and millions of people. And in no time flat, there were news stories appearing around the globe about this lost cat. Millions of people saw the videos, and they saw the articles, and they saw the updated face page. People sent in money, lots and lots of money to care for Kankush's medical needs and his travel costs. Now, Amy knew that her time on Lesbos was coming to an end, and she had to move on. So she made arrangements for herself. She got a passport for Diaz, and herself and Diaz to fly to Germany, where another couple, British couple, Simon and Emma, were willing to take care of him and continue the search for his family. And if they couldn't find the family after a year, they would adopt Diaz. And so she flew to Germany. And it was while they were in Germany that it happened. It was on February the 14th, 2016. On a news website, the oldest daughter who was watching it and listening because she'd learned English saw the story of the lost cat. Kankush! She said, Kankush, he's alive, come, it's Kankush. She contacted Amy through Facebook. She had enough English to do so, and she said, they were looking in the wrong place. I knew the other refugees had moved on to Germany, but her family had gone on. They got on and were now living in Norway. And the cat's real name was Kankush. Volunteers set up a Skype meeting with Kankush and his family. And when they saw him on the screen, they called out, Kankush, Kankush. His ears perked up, and he began to search everywhere for his family. A photojournalist named Doug, who'd been on Lesbos to film the refugees' plights and to help out wherever he could, had also gone to Germany to follow the refugees and continued to take their story to the world. He volunteered to take Kankush and fly with him from Germany to Norway. And once in Norway, he would deliver Kankush back to his true family. They'd be reunited. And so he had a little bit of trouble at the airport, even though despite he had the passport and the carrier. One of the supervisors said no, he couldn't get on board. The carrier was too small. But of course, Kankush very quickly showed everyone watching and listening that he could turn around quite nicely inside that carrier. And the supervisor very grudgingly told him to get on board. Once in Norway, Doug rented a car, and he drove 2 hours to the family's new home. They were waiting anxiously, excited finally to see their cat again. When he got there was a whole army of news people and cameras, TV cameras, and photographers from all over. He passed through the ranks and up to the door and knocked. And when Sarah opened the door, she had to step back, like a flash of all the light bulbs and flash cameras. And finally, when her eyes cleared, there, standing in front of her, was Doug, holding a fluffy white cat with yellow eyes and little pink nose shaped like a heart. And he took Kankush and placed Kankush in Sarah's hands. She started to weep. She wept, broke down and cried. Oh, me me baby, she cried, which means my darling. And the children all gathered around. Oh, Kankush, petted him and welcomed him home. And so that's how it happened. After 4 months and 5,000 miles, Kankush and his family were united once again. And this story, I think, goes very much with World Storytelling Day theme this year, which is Together We Can. And Kankush was reunited because of the efforts of many, many people all around the globe. And so that's the story of Kankush's incredible journey, Lost and Found Cat.
As part of World Storytelling Day this year, we are asking you to become involved in our student challenge. We have sent the sheets out to your teachers and you can get started right away. What we're asking you to do is to interview the children in your class that could be either immigrants or refugees or children of immigrants and refugees. And what we want you to do is find out about their culture, find out about what it was like to come to Canada. And also, think about ways in which you can help them to feel more comfortable in this country. Maybe you can help them with English, or perhaps you can tell them about Canadian traditions. And lastly, we'd like you to go home to your parents and grandparents and find out about your immigration or refugee stories, because it's great to know about your family history. I'd also like to ask the teachers to make sure that they return the audience surveys for your class. We need this for purposes of Storytellers of Canada and World Storytelling Day. Now at this point, I'd like to thank Storytellers of Canada and also the Ontario Arts Council and Canada Council for the Arts for their generosity to be able to host this event. And also, we'd like to thank both the Ajax and Clarington libraries for all the work that they have done to put this together. And of course, we'd like to thank you for listening to our stories about immigrants and refugees, and for demonstrating that together we can.